Take us at the table.
Hey everyone. Hope you hear me okay. I mean, I hear myself great, so I assume you do too. So, today I'm going to talk about governance in Web2 versus in Web3. And maybe we're going to, jump right in. So here's kind of my outline. My claim, hypothesis, position is basically going to be that Web2 governance has been hijacked, captured by corporations. And that in Web3, this hasn't happened yet, and that we might be able to prevent it from happening in Web3. This is basically the outline of my talk. So Web2, captured by corporations. So, what happened? Well, I mean, basically, there's big web corporations that provide big, important web services on computers on the internet. You've heard of them: Google, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix. These are, to name a few, and they have a big interest in the web. And then there's legitimate standards-making bodies that govern the web because people have kind of agreed to come around these things. And they have processes and rules for how the standards get formed. And then these big corporations participate in those standards, and then they produce stuff like DRM in all your browsers. And this kind of sucks. So the idea is that, okay, big corporate interests have captured the web by capturing the standards processes and governance processes of the web, and they had this big concentrated interest, and as a result, the users aren't really getting necessarily the best deal. It's somewhat better than it being captured by a single corporation. So what do we care? What are we complaining about, right? We're used to being owned by a single corporation. Now we're owned by a few. But they're still only really accountable to their shareholders in a really legally binding kind of way. And they have corporate governance. And so the interests of their users and the interests of their shareholders may not be aligned, as we kind of have seen play out over Web2 for a long time. With advertising and user data, the way that user data is treated, especially in the context of advertising. So the shareholder interests and the user interests are not really aligned. And put another way, the interests of the people who are owned not really aligned with the interests of the owners. It's George Carlin's face, rest in peace. And I think he's kind of right. We're kind of owned, and the big corporations own Web2, but they don't own Web3 yet. Is the claim. My claim is that actually, at the moment, we haven't been captured yet. And I think this might be a good thing because we might be able to produce a governance outcome where people are represented in a way that isn't possible with the corporate governance-driven governance that we have for the web. Where basically people have more control over their future as a netizen than we do today in Web2. And maybe, we won't be owned, and we'll have some notion of sovereignty in the web, where we have control and some notion that we control the future of us and our data. But it could totally still happen. It could totally still happen that Web3 could get captured by corporations. And actually, it could happen really rather easily. So, how can we prevent capture by the corporations? A lot of people think this is impossible. I'm a little bit more optimistic. We have some advantages, some built-in natural advantages just from the nature of blockchain technology and the nature of the Web3 stack. We have a service that's provided, instead of being provided kind of natively by a single company or single organization and from a single point on the web. We have these decentralized services that are provided for many jurisdictions by many parties. There's a decentralized server that's provided by many different people running many different pieces of that server. And the governance process in Web3, at least so far, happens in a decentralized multi-jurisdictional basis also. The people who participate in blockchain governance, people who participate in these standards for Web3 participate on an international basis in a pretty decentralized way. So it actually is relatively hard to govern the blockchain. You have to have legitimacy, broad-based international legitimacy, and this gives somewhat of an advantage relative to the Web 2, because with Web 2, all you really need is the major corporations that provide most of the value on the web. Because there's a small number of corporations that, with their massive computers and providing web services, provide the really kind of important traffic. So governance decisions in Web 3, my claim is, require more broad-based consensus than they did in Web 2. So this should kind of naturally be somewhat more democratizing, so naturally should mean that people have to compromise more and have more consensus, which should represent minorities more than happens in Web 2. And it's also really, because it's multi-jurisdictional, it's kind of harder for any national interest group to capture it. Perhaps you can argue that the web has been captured by US interests. There's this kind of interesting thing happening around GDPR and the big tech companies. There's some, not everyone is really too happy with the impact of the regime of the big web companies on the control of people's data and information that they use to run their lives. But this is going to be much harder to pull off in Web 3, I'm saying, or slightly harder, or at least a little bit naturally harder, because we have this multi-jurisdictional nature. So it's really hard for any one jurisdiction, like the US, for example, to take control. But we could really easily screw it up. We could legitimize a system that's susceptible to corporate takeover. And this is one of the things that is really interesting about the web versus the internet. The internet has done kind of a lot better than the web. And I think, hat tip to Harry, who was telling me about this earlier, that it might be because the Web 3 had, the web had W3C, which had standards processes that were easier to capture than the standards processes of the IETF. And so if we legitimize systems that are susceptible to takeover because they have clear rules by which they could be taken over, and if then I think we'll be basically asking for corporate capture, basically because we'll be legitimizing a system which we could expect through just some clear thinking that it would get captured. Because we have to realize we're going to try, if we're trying to provide a lot of value here, there's going to be people with concentrated interests, and they're going to want to try to capture the governance of Web 3 to extract as much value for themselves as possible. If there is a possibility for corporate takeover, then I think it's a very real possibility that people will pursue. And so I think the easiest way that we could possibly walk into corporate capture is to legitimize a process that is susceptible to corporate takeover. And then another big way is if we fail to achieve enough legitimacy to prevent external takeover. If we just fumble about and don't actually come to any kind of tangible governance process for Web 3, then what can totally happen is either some big corporation comes through and has a process that's more legitimate, or and proposes and maintains standards in a way that is better for users, and therefore people use those standards, and so we could be kind of taken over from the outside if we don't have processes that are legitimate enough. So these two things, right? We have to make sure that processes that we have legitimized are not susceptible to corporate takeover, and that we do have enough legitimacy in our processes so that we can't be taken over from the outside. It's pretty simple. I think that's all it really takes to prevent corporate takeover. Don't legitimize processes that can be taken over, and don't get taken over from the outside. It should be easy, right? Well, I'm glad you think so. So let's not screw up this opportunity, because we want to not be owned for the Web 3. We want people to have control over the futures of their digital lives. But it's completely possible that we will throw it away, and that we'll lead our collective governance to be run by a few dudes or a few corporations. I hope that we will resist the urge to legitimize anything that can be taken over, but that we'll also work to building legitimate governance processes so that we do have something to offer on the side of governance when there is actually a need for it, so that we're not taken over from the outside. So with that, I'm going to open up for questions and answers. We got a lot of time for questions and answers. So, taking volunteers. Oh, I'll take applause first. Thank you. Yeah. Oh, wait. Let's throw the box. Let's throw the. Yeah. Just throw the.
Which more traditional decision-making process do you think should remain process-less in Web3, such as like the election of leaders?
Sorry, I don't understand the question.
So, I mean, you mentioned that in previous iterations of like how do you set standards, for example, they had certain rules in place, certain processes, by which if you just follow them, if you just play the rules in a certain way, then you're able to, take some amount of power, some amount of seats on whatever the decision-making body is. So my question is, which of these rules or processes is most key to keep in a more decentralized fashion to avoid that kind of outcome?
Yeah. So the example I think from the IETF is which is also the example that we have in Bitcoin and blockchain kind of a lot, is the rough consensus and running code model, where basically you kind of you don't have a clear decision of the different definition of what it means to have consensus, but when you roughly know that everyone who's a stakeholder or key opinion person on that issue agrees, that you kind of have rough consensus. And but I'm definitely not the most qualified to talk about this. You should ask Harry. He's up next. He knows. Harry will give us the answers. No. Save them for later, Harry. Save it. It's really tricky, though. Where's the mic cube? All right, let's hear it.
So, as you know, Facebook and Apple and Google and all these big corporations are also part of the W3C and the organizations that manage standards. And these companies sort of also built Web2. So knowing that, don't you think that perhaps also an issue that we should be concerned with is ensuring that companies in the blockchain space and those building these technologies don't become major corporations with shareholders and corporate interests rather than being the issue of being taken over from the outside?
Yeah, I mean, here. Yeah, definitely a concern that the companies that develop the technology end up capturing it. However, for legal liability reasons, they're usually software companies, and they usually are not involved in any kind of business that isn't production of open source software. And so I hope that they will keep that role, angle, and only be software companies producing open source software, so that rather than say also running nodes and also taking other responsibilities in governance. I think that would be really it would be much harder for them to capture the process if all they're doing is developing the software. It's much easier for them to capture the process if they're taking all of the responsibilities across the whole ecosystem. And so I hope that development and developers want to just be developers. I don't want to be, lords of the blockchain.
Hey, Vlad, thanks for the talk. Given the context of what you've just been talking about, especially with Web3C and the other standards organizations, what do you think of the process of pushing through ERCs, for example?
The what of pushing through ERCs?
The process of putting through an ERC standard versus, say, Web3C, and in the context of your talk.
I'm not really an expert on like standards processes, But so I don't really know. Sorry about that.
You used the word legitimacy a few times in the context of corporations and in the context of the new efforts. How would you define legitimacy?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I kind of have a definition of legitimacy that I use, and it's not super duper orthodox. So I use legitimacy to mean like this kind of common knowledge that some people might have that we're going to go with a decision. And common knowledge is like this kind of type of shared information that we talk about like in game theory, where people can act like something's a fact. And so if we can act like it's a fact that we're going to go with a governance decision or a mechanism within like our group, then like within that group it's legitimate. And so the state of knowledge and coordination that we know that we can go with a decision is legitimacy. Or for the state of knowledge that we have about a process that we know that we're going to continue to use it is legitimacy. Or for like a norm that we're going to continue to adopt it and respect that norm is this legitimacy. So it's kind of this collective state of knowledge that we're going to use something for the sake of coordination going forward. And you know, I think it's a notion of legitimacy that captures pretty much everything people talk about with legitimacy, but I get into arguments with people about this all the time. And so it may not be perfect. But from my like game theory kind of background, it's nice. Anyone got the mic right now? Yeah. Hey.
Hi. So you mentioned being captured, like Web3 being captured. And the way I look at Satoshi Nakamoto is she dropped a piece of software on the world that disrupted the world. And that was, I look at that as kind of a gift to the world. So I'm wondering, do you think that avoiding being captured requires a gift to the world of software developers? Do they have to avoid trying to make a profit in a certain way? Does it require a gift is what I'm asking.
I mean, that's a really interesting question. I mean, basically the question, kind of the way that I'm parsing it or understanding is like, does it need to be that like the economic model for sustaining development like is separate from, you know, the constraints on the outputs of the developers? And you know, like basically like there's a big difference when you're paid to do some work and you have to do what the person who's paying you wants, and when you're giving something as a gift and you can do it kind of freely the way you want. And I think that's like an excellent question, and I sure hope not. Like I sure hope that we could figure out how to avoid capture without having to not have people be paid except for with gifts, or not have people do work except for as a gift. I hope that we can avoid capture without having to go that far. But I think that like, you know, gift giving, especially when you have like anonymous donors and donees, like is really, really hard to. It can lead to a really low strings attached situation, which can be really nice.
Can you provide a tangible example within Web3 of how you think corporate capture could play out?
Yeah, I would love to. So my favorite example is coin voting governance, where basically we decide, oh, look, we're going to say that the coin holders are going to be in charge of protocol upgrades. And then, like, if you own a majority of the coins or, like, some threshold, some amount, depending on how many people show up, whatever amount of coins, then you get to push decisions through. Then like, what could happen, conceivably, is that corporations buy up enough coins to make things happen through the process. I realize this is very contentious, maybe with some of you, but I swear to God, that corporations could capture coin voting. I swear to God, it could happen. Don't tempt fate. Could happen.
Yeah, it probably will. About the role of corporations, they have played a role in our current infrastructure. Like, corporations have paid big proportion of the internet infrastructure, not only the states. It's also been a corporation that paid for it. And then they played a role in Web2, where they made it ubiquitous, actually.
Yeah.
Facebook made it made my grandmother use the internet.
Sure.
And now, so to the question, do you see a legitimate role of corporations in Web3?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the answer is like absolutely yes. And I also think that like, oh, corporations, there's all sorts of different types of corporations and we shouldn't just lump them all into one basket. And I'm sorry for doing that. You know, definitely corporations deserve more respect than I've given them in this talk or in the last 20 minutes. I think that like corporations, like, you know, probably in some form or another have a place in the world. But I also think that like the idea of like, you know, representing like these stakeholders at the expense of like the public is something that like is kind of not super conscionable. And so I think there are like I have certain problems with the way corporate governance has worked out in big corporations in some cases, but that's just because like I think that like they should be, you know, beholden to the public before they're beholden to their shareholders, and that's like maybe radical. I don't know, but you know, they just have to do. They basically instead have to just only do things that are legal, but like they go for the shareholders first. And I think like, you know, so I question whether the like corporate governance is like really the thing that will like keep us safe forever. But I think that, you know, for now, would I like wish that corporations go away? Like, no. Please no, I need my disposable goods.
Hey, Vlad. So it turned out in Web2 that one of the big centralizing vectors was identity, right? There was no like identity layer in Web2, and kind of Facebook provided that. I'm just wondering, aside from like explicit capture of governance or coin voting, like you mentioned, are there other vectors that you see that are risky in Web3 that might lead to you know, centralization on the part of corporations or whatever, like identity?
Yeah, so I mean, now that we're talking about the applications stack, there's all sorts of different places that it could happen, right? Because like we need oracles, we need credential and access control management systems, we need like dispute resolution. There's like basically there's a lot of layers where things can go wrong that isn't just blockchain governance, right? And I haven't really given that enough credence in this talk, but definitely, you know, expect every layer to be captured. Stay on the right. Defend every layer.
Yeah, hi Vlad. In 2007 we saw a complete focus on decentralization and we're going forward with that. But I think the technology maybe is not yet ready. So would you see more hybrid models in the immediate time? Or should we all focus on complete decentralized models?
I mean, it depends on the application. So it's a tough one for me to say. So for some applications, you know, the decentralized model is great. For some applications, it's not. It depends partially on engineering realities, but partially it's more like do you need an oracle? Do you like, you know, like, and if so, then, you know, you better get a trusted person in there, like at least in the short term. But yeah, so yeah, like in some way, I think like there's still much to be asked for in the layer of like, you know, oracles, dispute resolution, and this kind of like more subjective layer of the protocol stack, or of like, you know, some kind of application development framework, toolkit, toolbox, stack. Yeah. Hi.
Thank you. I just finally get it. I have a small question, actually. Not just governments. I mean, in how we do it in open source, and in open source software development, right? Actually, if you take into the consideration how the process made in a Linux Foundation, for example, there is a Linux who decides what's right or what, but at the same time there is a consensus and everybody can say to Linus, you're not right, and if argument is strong enough, like there's no problem so to change the decision. And because people who are working in software development are kind of on the same page, they have the same in the same level of information. They are knows the same truth, more or less. Like there's differences, but we have like in a pull request, for example. At some point, we're reaching a consensus, and everybody are happy. Like finally, when we are like everybody like have to, approve the pull request, and we're reaching the consensus, the actual consensus here, and everybody are really happy. No compromises, only consensus. So it's how it works. Like around me, it works like this. But in other companies, somewhere maybe it works differently. Maybe there is some opinion leadership which is like decides what's right, what's wrong, and there's kind of compromise. And people like who don't like this decision, they're like, okay, so he knows better or something. So also there are people who are have to decide, make a decision in a situation of lack of information. I mean, they have to try to look like to find an authority who will decide, like a representative, somebody who will decide for them on the important issues which will be have an effect on their lives.
Mm-hmm.
So, but they kind of not understand what the decision will be, but there will be a decision. Maybe my life will be better, but I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I hope, because I don't have enough information. Also, there are people who think that they have all information to make a good, strong decision, and they are also maybe, it's not just my subjective opinion, yeah? There's people who think that, okay, I have enough information to
Anyways,
make a decision.
I think I get the story.
And yeah, that's like, and they're pushing, like they're saying like, they're like, make it like political or something. They're like, I know, but if you're asking questions to these people, like specific questions, like about
that's right,
about the topic, and they have no answers.
Of course, yeah.
But they are fucking, sorry.
Yeah.
Sure that they are knowledge enough.
Mm-hmm.
But you really, when you speak with somebody, you really, sometimes you can't understand if he's like knowledge enough or not. It's like, but because he said, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a problem with governments.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely a struggle to form an opinion that is like somehow representative, like somehow relates like what you want to reality and to what decisions that other people might have to make. It's really hard to make that like well formed in a way that like other people can like represent you and like your opinion, like when like you don't even know what's going on, but you just know that you're affected and you want to be heard somehow. And so I think we have like different levels of participation in governance, just kind of naturally. Like if you participate on Twitter by harassing me, it's very different than you're participating in EAPS. And you don't need to be very qualified at all to harass me on Twitter. You can harass Vitalik on Twitter too, and you do. And you don't have to be very qualified at all to do that. And in some way, there's also lots of good faith, low information participation in governance on Reddit, Twitter, even on GitHub we see lots of low information posters. And it definitely causes headaches for people, but I think it's a struggle for participants in blockchain governance because you don't really, someone comes in and wants to participate and they don't know what they're talking about or doing, and you have to orient them and you really have to take time, and it sucks.
Thank you very much for that.
Cheers, no problem.
Yes, we have the clicker here. Yes.